the moment that I'm going to start. So welcome everybody. My name is Eric Kleinenberg. I am the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. That's where you are right now. You probably don't realize that you're at the Institute for Public Knowledge, but welcome. This is our virtual space. We are one of the co-sponsors and hosts of the Future of Democracy program, which our featured speaker tonight, Beth Noveck, has been directing. Beth, as you know, is also the director of the GovLab at NYU. And she is a woman doing many things. And now, in addition to doing that, she is at Northeastern as a professor this year on leave from NYU. And she's directing the Burns Family Center for Social Change and Impact, and its partner project is the GovLab. So she has both of those things going. Beth, it's somewhat awkward for me to be describing her formally because Beth is a colleague and also someone I've gotten to know well as a friend these last several years in New York. She is a tremendous collaborator and a fierce social and political critic, as well as just a great thinker. And one of the things that I love about what Beth does is that Beth does things. You probably have seen in her bio that she calls the GovLab a do tank. Sorry, not a do tank, not a think tank, a do tank. And I hope at some point tonight she's going to tell us what that's all about. But the context for our conversation, as you know, is that she has just published this book, Solving Public Problems. It's out with Yale University Press. It is an unusual book. It's a kind of a combination of an analytic book that has a kind of take on how to think more effectively, how to do research more effectively, how to define problems more effectively. But it's also kind of a how-to book. It's a practical guide. It's a book not just for thinkers, but for doers. And it genuinely walks that line in a way that you don't see very often. And that's not a surprise to anyone who knows Beth or the GovLab or the Future of Democracy project. But it's extraordinary to see it written in this way. And I believe that Sam, who works with us at IPK and at the GovLab, has just shared with you links to Solving Public Problems on the chat here. And for those of you who are veterans at the Institute for Public Knowledge, you know, like one of the things we love to do is to have the booksellers come to these events. And, you know, we typically offer all this, you know, great free food and drink and a gathering place. Do you remember gathering places where we used to come together physically and share space? So we do all that, and we create an occasion, and we make sure that the bookseller at the end of the night walks home without carrying any books. And so we can't tell you that it's mandatory that you take a book home tonight, but you now have links both to the GovLab and also to the site where you can purchase Solving Public Problems through Yale University Press. The format for tonight is I've asked for Beth to tell us, you know, how this book came about, why now. You might share with me the notion that this is in some ways the best possible moment for a book that's a practical guide about how to fix our government and change the world with government, but maybe also a sense that in some ways that seems like a very big ask, you know, to expect that government is going to solve routine problems, let alone things like how we get out of the pandemic and how we deal with climate change and racial injustice and the many other kind of overlapping crises we face at the moment. But Beth has published a book into this. And so I want to ask Beth to get us going in this conversation by discussing, you know, where this push comes from and why now. But quickly, before we do that, a note on the format. I've asked Beth to speak for a little bit, then she and I are going to engage in conversation. And then we have a lot of extraordinary people I can see already who are joining us here online. So we will open it up to questions. You just have to write them into the chat or I guess the chat is the best way to do that tonight. Or possibly we could get some raised hands as well and bring people into the conversation if we can get the technology working. So you have either of those options, but probably writing a question is going to be the easiest way to do it. So we will wrap at 6 o'clock. And with that, I think we have a good group here already. And Beth, welcome to Virtual IPK. Congratulations on this really extraordinary book. And I wonder if you could get us going tonight by just telling us, how did you come to, how did you come to decide that we really do have a chance to do things better, with government, that this is really a plausible project for the moment that we're in right now, and not just a plausible one, but a necessary one.
Eric, thank you so much. If for no other reason than taking over the moderation duties for me tonight, I'm glad to get a break. It's very nice to see so many familiar names in the attendee list and many new names, many people to whom I owe emails, I fear. But I'm delighted for the conversation that we're going to have now. And in the chat, there is also the Q&A button. Any way you want to reach us. Eager for your comments, your questions, and your reflections on this important moment. And it is an important moment, which is why I wanted to do this book now. I mean, as a practical matter, I wrote it now because COVID gave me the chance to write it and to finish a project that had been underway for many years, in fact. But where we all, thanks to the lack of travel and the moment that we were in, whether it's COVID and the really acute challenge of the public health crisis that we've been facing, the associated economic crisis of unemployment, but ballooning unemployment and all the associated challenges, or frankly, the chronic problems that we have all been struggling with and will continue to struggle with, whether it's the existential threat of climate change, of racial injustice and inequity, generations-long widening economic inequality. There are a lot of problems in the world that we need to tackle. And I think that it would be, I am not alone, let me say, in getting up, especially during the pandemic each day, and listening to the news, during the Trump administration that preceded and followed, and just feeling like we need to do something more. And so that was the impetus for this book, is to really answer the question, what more can we do? What more can we do both as institutions, but also as individuals, to really address the challenges of our time? And so it would be easy, especially in light of all of these challenges, and really the nadir of those challenges, if you will, on January 6th, when we really thought that the institutions that we have erected to address these challenges may be, in crisis and at their end, but at the very least ill-equipped to be able to respond to these challenges. I still approach this from the perspective, a very optimistic perspective, to say that the tools to solve our challenges, the tools, the methods, the approaches, now in the 21st century, with the kinds of technological advances we've had, scientific advances and social scientific advances, and here I want to give a shout out to Eric and his work and his wonderful book, Palaces for the People, which we'll say more about in the course of this conversation, but our understanding that comes in much part from your work of how to engage with and listen to communities, how to use data in new and exciting ways, how to combine these qualitative and quantitative approaches really gives us a playbook for how we can do things differently. And we saw that very much during COVID. So I have the privilege, in addition to my academic work, to lead a team of technologists and designers and engineers and policy professionals in the Office of Innovation for the state of New Jersey. And look, there were many, many things that we did wrong or we didn't do enough of, but there were some really bright moments where, we turned around and we partnered with a private sector tech company and the state's universities to be able to put up a COVID response site in 3 days and respond to the tide of disinformation and misinformation by providing a reliable source of information that's been used by something like 150 million people. The ability then to turn around and listen to residents and talk to seniors about their experience with vaccines and be able then to redesign to design and fail, and then redesign a system for distributing vaccines to people, to be able to do projects like we did with Federation of American Scientists, where we collaborated with a network of 600 scientists to be able to provide real-time responses to people's questions about COVID. And there are countless examples like this from around the world of how governments, civil society organizations, and individuals have done things right that I think we can learn from. And so it's inspired by examples like these, and very much not, my own or those of my team, but people all around the world that we have talked to and worked with and coached over the years. It's Samir Brahmachari in India, the former head of Science India, who built a network of 8,000 students and scientists to crowdsource the better drugs in response to tuberculosis and other diseases that affect the poor, where drug companies have not made progress in 40 years. And within the space of 5 years, they're in clinical trials on several new approaches to addressing tuberculosis. It's Jonathan Wachtel in the city of Lakewood, Colorado, the lone city planner in a community of 150,000 people, who, rather than put up his hands and say, there's nothing much I can do as one person about climate change, who leveraged a network of 20,000 residents to develop 500 different projects to address sustainability and climate change, and has now spread that model to 4 different cities and has created a network called the Sustainable Solutions Network. I could go on and on and on with these examples, but let me just summarize by saying what they give us is a playbook for focusing on problems and for really learning what it means to define the problem that we're trying to solve, regardless of politics, and to laser beam our focus on what those problems are, to use data, especially big data and the technologies of machine learning that allow us to make sense of a large quantity of data, to understand from 10,000 feet up why a problem is actually occurring, but also then to use technology to enable us to engage with citizens, like most of these examples refer to be able to coordinate networks of people and to get the 1,000-foot view, or the worm's eye view rather than the bird's eye view, of why a problem is actually happening and how citizens actually experience it. And then to be able to develop the skills of what we might call evidence synthesis or rapid evidence review, or I sometimes call it fast field scanning. How do I look out there for what else has already worked in other communities and bring that to my own community? So there's a set of skills, and I outline 7 of them in the book and explain how people have used them both inside government and outside as what we might call social innovators outside of government, or public entrepreneurs inside government, how people are leveraging these skills to be able to solve problems in new and exciting ways, and wanting to do more, to your point, than simply describe something and leave it at that. The book also includes how-tos. So how do you apply these skills to your own work? And we provide worksheets for how to do that, and a free course which complements the book, that's available at solvingpublicproblems.org, and where we now gratefully have participants from 80 countries learning with us how to advance their mission-driven work. So let me wrap up here with a quick reflection, which is that there is today really no defined field that we could call public problem solving. There are countless people working on social change and social impact inside government and outside. I'm sitting at the moment at Northeastern University, coming from a 2-hour discussion with a room full of those people doing engaged, community-led social impact work. But outside of law schools, where we talk about public interest law, we don't in universities have a field called social change or social impact. For a generation now, universities have invested in teaching people entrepreneurship, how to start a business. And I'm really excited about the fact that we're now on the cusp of really being able to take some of these skills and to build this field of social impact and really develop a field of study, a field of education, and a field of knowledge. And I'm thrilled to also report that thanks to the generosity of the Burns family, we're able to start a new center called the Burns Family Center for Social Change and Social Impact, that will be able to crystallize some of these lessons and help to bring these learnings, hopefully, to more people to be able to inspire more social change in our communities. So let me stop with that and get to the comments and questions. And
Well, that's great. So I mean, I guess where I want to start, Beth, is by really asking you to dig into this idea about how we define a public problem. And one of the things that's so striking about reading your book for someone who doesn't spend a lot of their time in the kind of policy making world or in the social change world is that the kind of depth and precision with which the people and institutions you're interested in are defining problems is just very different than the kind of general conversation. So like if you were to tune into a news television program, it seems as if the kind of core problems that we have to deal with in the world are things like climate change or government corruption, or people complain that we're losing our fundamental freedoms because of government overreach, or they complain that there's authoritarianism that's crushing democracy. Like we talk about problems at that scale, and it seems to me like in your book, you're not really talking about problems that way. You're breaking them down and trying to push us to think about things more narrowly, to redefine issues so that we can get more traction on them one by one. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just this whole issue of problem definition and how important it is, to pause a little bit.
absolutely. So first, I have to confess that when we talk about we named the book Solving Public Problems, we talk about solving public problems, but I see from the discussion here that John Seeley Brown is here, and he will not remember that probably 10 years ago, he said to me, "Kid, you can't ever solve a public problem. As soon as you try to solve it, it morphs, it changes. We can tackle it, but we can't solve it." And so there is a way in which the kinds of problems you're talking to, the kinds of really enormous challenges from climate change to racial injustice to economic inequality, to the political partisanship that bedevils us, these challenges are so massive that they partly lead to the kind of despair, the kind of shoulder shrugging and giving up. How can I make a difference that so many of us are familiar with? Which is why there's a real discipline, an art, if you will, or even a science to the concept of problem definition. There's a wonderful Russian writer who wrote a book called, now I'm blanking on the name of the book. The methodology was called TRIZ. That stands for acronym for something in Russian that I definitely can't remember at 5 o'clock.
This is what the chat function is for. So we could,
is to help me
crowdsource this. But
my own, anybody who's read the book knows it's the first thing you've ever heard me talk about it. I talk about him all the time. He said, there's a science of problem solving. Stalin didn't like that, and they sent him to Siberia for suggesting we don't teach enough problem solving. So luckily, I hopefully will not get sent to Siberia, but I agree that we don't teach enough problem solving. And we need to teach what it means to define these kinds of really knotty problems. Some people might call them wicked problems. You might call them policy or societal problems. And it's one of the big gaps in both how we govern and in how we educate people. So in governance in particular, we reward people for coming up with solutions. We want them to come up with answers. But the result of which, when you start with the solution, in our last iteration of this Future of Democracy Working Group, we had the writers from Stanford who have a new book out called System Failure. And they talk about what happens at Stanford when you do that. You get a bunch of apps littering the floor that are solutions to problems that nobody has. So what do? We need to take the time to actually develop a discipline for learning how to use both data and community wisdom or public engagement, whatever name you want to give it, but the perspective of the people experiencing the problem, as well as data, that bird's eye view and that worm's eye view, to bring them together to really understand the problem so that we can define it more narrowly in a way that actually then allows us to come up with solutions. You know, if you're a professor or a teacher participating, we all know about the students who say, I'm going to solve climate change by Christmas. And so this is about a process of going from the much bigger challenge to what I would call a narrower, more actionable problem with data back of it, with citizen perspective back of it, that allows us to really take action. And that's a large part of what we do as a practical matter, is we train people in how to define problems. So quick last example here so that you can get to some of your other questions. We are doing a project with the city of Oakland now, focused on allowing residents and enabling residents, faculty and students at Mills College and the city to be able to come up with solutions to hard urban challenges together. We will not get anywhere unless we first sit down with the city and its residents to really define how do people really experience issues like illegal dumping, abandoned autos, and homelessness. How do they experience that in practice? It's only by doing that hard work that we will actually be able to develop solutions that work. So let me stop with that and get
so I mean, I just want to stay on this thread a little bit, because at first it sounds very simple, you know, take a big problem, you know, a big issue, break it down into constituent parts, you know, find a narrow thing that you can focus on and figure out a way to address it. And, you know, I know that you said you were extensively involved with the state of New Jersey, thinking about its COVID response. You know, you worked in the Obama administration, you've worked at 10 Downing, like you've been in these messes, you know, actually dealing with urgent issues breaking in real time. And to go back to New Jersey, you know, not long ago, one would think that like the global COVID pandemic would be too big a thing to try to solve in, you know, its entirety, but that maybe a smaller piece of it that would be pragmatic would be like, if we're in a moment in an infectious disease situation where you don't have medicine, you don't have a vaccine, a simple thing to do is to encourage people to wear masks, you know, as a simple measure of your respect for other people, concern about other people's health. You know, that seems like we could push that. That turned out to be just tremendously complicated, right? Like getting people to wear masks. And I wonder, like, if we're in your problem defining mode and problem solving mode, how would you help us to think about that whole morass?
Absolutely.
Mask wearing?
So, as we know, a problem like mask wearing has why people don't wear masks has very different root causes. You're the sociologist, so you can tell us better what those root causes are. But obviously, if the root cause is disinformation and misinformation, it's a very different set of solutions than if the root cause is lack of access to masks or can't afford masks. So just that process of being able to identify what is really the root cause of the problem is simplistic in many ways, but it's actually very, very hard to do in practice because we don't have the time, we don't have the energy, we don't have the kind of environment that affords us the opportunity to spend the time doing that. So if we have to race towards a solution, if we have to have the answer, if we are taught, you know, that being the expert means having the answers to things, it can be very difficult to pause, to open up, to listen, and to have the humility to say, I may not understand the problem. Apropos of listening, I apologize. I understand the chat is disabled. So if we can do anything about that while we are here, I don't think we can midstream. So please use the Q&A and we will see it. And if you want to, or you can use Twitter and complain there. So I'm sorry that the chat is disabled. I'm hearing.
No complaining on Twitter, please. We can use the Q&A. That's better.
Anybody who knows me knows that transparency and collaboration are my hallmark. So I apologize for that. That is an oversight. We'll try to fix it if we can.
Wait, so I don't know if you're finished with the answer. Did you want to stop there?
So I think the point is that the idea is simple, but the practice is very, very difficult. And believe me, when we have surveyed people across multiple countries now, and we're expanding our 4-country survey into a 7-country survey of public servants to understand whether people use the skill of problem definition. And once they learn it, whether they then use it in their work. And the answer is very few people actually use it. And when they learn how to do it, then they use it all the time. That's the shorthand answer to that. So
one of the elements of this problem definition process is more participatory work on the part of policymakers or powerful institutions. Am I getting you right on that? Like, be more actively involved in listening to the things your constituents are telling you, what people understand based on their own ground level knowledge from where they live. Is that the idea?
That is part of the idea, but that has to be combined also with uses of data that give us a different perspective on the problem as well. So it's the combination of the two that I think gives us the most well-rounded understanding of the problem to enable us to come up with solutions that will be responsive to the problem. Or, as you have pointed out in your work, and you may mention that, it allows us to get a different perspective on why the problem is actually happening and to open up our imagination to completely new ideas.
I think that's right. I mean, what's hard, I think, I'm just trying to think through this with you, is the grounded experiences are so varied now, and the sources of information are so varied. And if we're talking about solving public problems in a contemporary world where there's this thing called the internet and misinformation is to be taken for granted, and a lot of our media is ideological, it seems as if it's going to get messy once you're down there, and it will be hard to figure out what the lesson is. So, like, for instance, I think about if we want to understand how to increase vaccination rates, and we want to go to Florida and Texas and Georgia and learn what's happening on the ground. I have a hard time knowing what we do with that information, and I wonder if you have thoughts about about that.
I think this is why it's so important to have a set of methods and tools and approaches. It's not a free-for-all, because done wrong, you can end up, and by the way, we don't have a huge amount of learning and evidence about what is the right way to do this all the time. Done wrong, you can open up, you either create echo chambers, you create shouting matches, you create, dialogue that is anything but civic. You create more opportunities for people to manipulate the discussion. So really developing our learning, and that's where a lot of research is needed in how to do that, how to use tools to help us do that effectively, is extremely important, number one. I think number two, though, the relentless focus on defining the problem and focusing people on a problem really helps, though, to avoid some of those challenges. So in other words, when, our colleague Clay Shirky likes to say, and you can agree or disagree with this, there isn't a Democratic or Republican way of taking out the trash. He said this long before Donald Trump and COVID. This is an earlier statement, so I think he might take this back now in some way. There may be a Democratic and a Republican way of taking out the trash these days. But that said, when we can channel our attention to solving a problem, that is, reducing the amount of trash from X to Y, increasing literacy from A to B, doing the following, that really helps us to escape some of the most egregious challenges of partisanship by focusing us on a process for problem definition and then creating measurable solutions to the problem as defined. But coming back to your earlier question, a public problem and how we define it is precisely a problem that is going to be politically contested, that exists in a fraught environment where we don't even have agreement that there is a problem, let alone what its root causes are. So this is not, again, simple in concept, very difficult in the execution, lots of need for learning, but we have some pretty good ideas now and experience about what works and how to apply it that can get us started.
So, you've invoked this idea that we're going to use multiple forms of evidence. We're interested in different kinds of data, so that what people think and experience on the ground is part of our data package, but so too is the kind of computational data that we're awash in now, and that we're just learning how to make sense of for policy making. We're just learning how to interpret it and analyze it as social scientists, and we're obviously going to get much better at it. Would you mind describing a kind of a case where bringing in computational data really helped you see a problem differently?
Sure. So let me give, we have and I think there are lots of people here who can share some of their experiences. Some of the most successful examples really are, again, people who have done both. So it's people like the I-Team or innovation team in the city of New Orleans, which wanted to bring down the murder rate in New Orleans, which you know more about than I do, has one of, and has for a long time had one of the highest murder rates among cities across America. And so I think what made their work successful and made them able to reduce the homicide rate by 25% in the first year and every year thereafter, with a bump during COVID that many of us saw in cities across America, was the fact that they combined both. They looked at data about recidivism, about crime, about unemployment, about education. They looked at it by neighborhood. They tried to understand where those hotspots are, but they didn't rely only on looking at the data. They, in addition, also talked to people affected. That included people who both were victims of crime, but also the incarcerated, the formerly incarcerated, and their families, to get a really holistic view on the situation and enable them both, number one, to define the problem, but also then to develop targeted responses and solutions. So, a completely different example, coming back to New Jersey, during COVID, we worked with the Economic Development Authority there to look at data on job loss, on economic development, on disparities of COVID impact. But then we also talked to businesses about what are their needs, how are they experiencing the problem, and then turned around and developed a set of policy responses, grant programs, financing mechanisms that I think, because of that interplay of both data and engagement, allowed New Jersey to be the third most successful state in terms of helping the business community. So after California and New York, much, much bigger states. And you could say, look, it's just because you gave away money, and so of course that was helpful. But I think that ability to be so responsive and to target the design of the policy and services to what the needs are, I think is extraordinarily important. Last thing here, which is partly by way of a plug, which is not a problem we've solved yet, but a problem we need to solve. Growing out of some work we've been doing, I've served as the chair of the Future of Work Commission for the state. We have $10 million to spend in the next year on designing lifelong learning accounts. So we can talk to people about their needs for upskilling, about the impediments to upskilling, about what would cause them to go out and get training. But unless we actually look at the data at the same time and take a computational perspective to understand what are the highest growth job sectors, what are the highest growth job sectors in the state, what are the training programs that exist to which people have access, what are the costs of those training programs, we need to be able to look at data sets at the same time as we talk to people, and then we can design solutions and mechanisms that are really responsive. And the same thing is true whether you're developing a national policy program or whether you're frankly developing an app as an individual working in a community. That little bit of data plus engagement, I think, can really help us to go a long way. And if you don't know how to do it for yourself, there are phenomenal resources out there, people who are willing to help and provide that kind of data science expertise.
Nice. There's another thing you write about. I'm obviously very sympathetic to this idea, but I think flows naturally from what you're discussing now. And that is, one of your recommendations is that in the problem-solving mode, we take advantage of what these things you call positive deviant cases, or idea of when you have positive deviance, you can learn something about solving a problem that you might not see if you're more focused on criticism. It's striking to me as a social scientist that we're often very good at taking things apart and showing why things don't work. We tend to be focused on the critical side, and yet there are a lot of things that work better than you would expect them to, and we can learn from studying them. And I wonder if you can talk about how you see positive deviance playing a role in problem solving.
There are a number of techniques that people have developed for doing this work of better defining the problem. And so positive deviance, and Eric, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, whether it was the Sternins, Monique and Jerry Sternin, development professionals in working for Children's Aid in Vietnam, who developed the term. But they were surely among some of its noted practitioners, who essentially asked the question, how do we turn the problem on its head, not by looking at what's failing, but looking at what's working as a way of defining the problem. So in Vietnam, they looked at poverty and hunger among children in rural villages in Vietnam. And instead of studying, as many development professionals do, let's look at the hungry children and see what kind of aid we can give them, they looked at the similar kinds of communities and asked why in certain communities were children not suffering malnutrition. And that allowed them to understand what was going on in terms of the feeding habits of parents. That really changed their perspective. Eric Schatt, mathematician at Mount Sinai Hospital, does positive deviance in terms of disease research. He's not a geneticist, he's a mathematician. And he uses large-scale data to troll through huge amounts of data to find people who have 2 recessive genes, but who don't manifest a condition. And then to look at, the 10 people who have the 2 recessive genes, but who don't have the condition, as a way of trying to better understand the problem and the pathways to disease. And maybe, Eric, you would say a word about your own work with regard to Chicago and heat waves as it comes to positive deviance.
Well, I want to keep the focus on your book, but
all right, you're cheating. Eric has done really path-breaking work in this, and I write about his work in the book, which is to look at why do some people, for example, in a heat wave or in a natural disaster like Katrina, why do some people fare better than others? So that technique of turning the problem on its head, the technique of getting people from different disciplinary perspectives to look at a problem, the famous anecdote of the slow elevator, the idea of getting the psychologist to look at the problem of the slow elevator instead of the engineer, is what reveals then the solution that instead of the $1 million new engine and new elevator, it's the $5 mirror or Muzak or quiz system in the elevator that can be the solution to the problem. So there are techniques out there. There are tools, there are heuristics that can be applied. And what I try to do is to bring some of them together into a curriculum that's designed really to help people advance their project from idea to implementation.
Yeah, I'm glad you're talking about a curriculum, because I want to talk to you about your work in the university world. You worked in government, and you've been at NYU for a while, and now you're at Northeastern, building programs that teach differently. And I mean, I guess I need to ask you to say something about the concept of a do tank. I keep saying that wrong. A do tank, and also what you think its role is in the teaching of people who are going to be involved in policy or social change. Is this kind of thing on the curriculum right now? I mean, it strikes me that the kinds of courses you're teaching could easily be part of a public policy school. They could easily be part of a law school. You could be part of a social work school. I'm not as sure how it fits into social science, but clearly there's a lot of social science work that goes into problem defining and problem solving. I can't tell you how many times I have students who come to me, even doctoral students, and they want to they want to work on something, but what they tell me they want to work on is like a vague, fuzzy problem, like an issue. And the challenge for them is to come up with a researchable question, right? That's basically the analog to your public problem defined properly. It needs to be like a researchable question that you can actually advance. So could you talk to me a little bit about, your thoughts on the way that we're teaching students to do social change and to solve problems now in universities, and then what you'd like to do, whether it's GovLab or your new center.
So I think we're not doing enough in universities. I think we have, as I alluded to before, made a generation-long investment, not a bad one, a good thing to teach people how to start businesses. We want to teach students to become the next, Mark Zuckerberg. But I think that students, especially now, are demanding that instead of learning to move fast and break things, we want to learn how to move fast and fix things. And that's what we have not been doing enough of. You're right, there are surely pockets of it, but there are a few challenges. One is this needs to cut across disciplines, because as we know, problems are complex, they're interdependent, and we're not going to solve them by working in a policy school alone or in a law school alone or in design or engineering by themselves. We need to bring these fields together, as some places are beginning to do, number one. Number two, too often problems, the way we tackle them in universities, are as prepackaged case studies. They are problems as already defined by somebody else. It's a project handed to you by an organization that you work on. So there's a great desire among students for more real-world engaged work and social impact work, but that requires learning truly how to define the problem. And third and lastly, we have done a lot in universities to focus on, especially design as a discipline, as it has kind of infected many other fields, to focus on allowing people to come up with good ideas. But what we don't teach students is how to implement those good ideas. And so by itself, invention, is not innovation. We have to actually teach people how to implement their ideas in the world. And that requires having an understanding of institutions, of power, of budgets. And that's really a missing piece. So even when we're teaching people design or design thinking, or to come up with inventions in the engineering disciplines, we're not teaching them about institutions. So it's really trying to bring together and create a more holistic curriculum that cuts across disciplines. And I will put in a little plug here in the chat, is we're trying to, for a new position that's open, to actually try to recruit a group of faculty who are interested in developing both curriculum and research, but to promote this idea of the teaching of social change across disciplines. So let me stop with that. I could say obviously a lot more, but we want to hear what others have to say too.
Okay, well, speaking of what others have to say, we have a lot of others saying things on the Q&A and on the chat. Let me ask you, everyone, there's still basically nobody has left our conversation after 45 minutes, Beth. So that's you're keeping them here. And
they're not here for the cheese cubes, it seems.
They're definitely not here for the cheese cubes or the mediocre red wine, but unless you have some at home. So some of you have put questions in the chat, which seems to be on again and off again. Would you mind, if you want it answered, putting it in the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen? I can't wait until we can do this in person again, but we're here for now. So a few questions. One is, we have a question from David Fleming, who asks, if you see viable intersections or collaborative opportunities between open source government solutions and blockchain, provided that it's sustainable, but it's not, technology. And if so, what advantages are there? Also, what challenges exist? And my apologies for the Snyder mark about blockchain. Maybe someone solved this problem.
I think David's parenthetical about provided it's sustainable reflects the same concern about the environmental impacts of blockchain that we worry about. But I think David articulates really a broader class of question, which is also what's the role of technology more generally in all of this? And I think that's an important part of thinking about a curriculum for social change and social impact today, as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago, is we have phenomenal tools that are available to us. Whether it's big data, whether it's machine learning, whether it's the technologies of collective intelligence, in other words, the technologies that allow us to have conversations and collaboration with people across a distance, whether it's blockchain that allows us to have, in which blockchain does many, many things, including secure record keeping fundamentally, and secure ways of, and anonymized ways of sharing information. As well as a profusion of open source technologies and the ability to, change these tools to adapt them for civic purposes. I think that's what makes this conversation so exciting right now. Obviously, there are lots of challenges with regard to ethical and responsible uses of these technologies. As you know, the academy is awash in criticism about algorithmic bias, the dangers of machine learning, the failures to use technology in ways that respect equity and diversity and sustainability. And that's why I think having a social change and social impact focus is so important for how we approach, and a democratic focus is so important for our conversations about technology more broadly, which is to ask ourselves, how are we using technologies to allow us to advance social justice and to solve problems in the world, rather than having the floor be littered with the apps that nobody wants. So blockchain, very much a part of this, and I will just put in the chat, or maybe Sam will, some work that the GovLab has done that you can find at blockchange.ge, which are case studies on uses of blockchain for social good and for governance that say a lot more than I have time to say right now.
Do you worry at all that this kind of use of data and the kind of interest in integrating new technologies for social change projects, is there kind of a risk of making this kind of world of social change like, I don't know, more elite one, a technocratic elite world, one that's exclusive, that, where kind of the traditional grassroots social change actors are interpreted or treated like second-class citizens, like they don't really know what the knowledge, what real knowledge is? How do you deal with that kind of concern?
Oops, sorry, I'm responding to questions and responding to your question at the same time. Turns out I'm not I'm not as good at multitasking as I think.
That's a tough multitask.
Let me not type and talk, and I'm ask me that one more time. The last part.
It's the listening part that's hard. No, just in this discussion, reading your book, I was struck by the relatively high bar for entry for some of these, processes. Like, one really needs to understand technology. One needs some technical training. We're talking about doing forms of data analysis that are hard for most people to do. Blockchain, I think a lot of people have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about using blockchain. So I just wonder whether this way of talking about problem solving and problem defining carries with it a risk of being exclusive and of making other ways of defining and solving problems feel like they are second rate.
Yeah. So first of all, none of these methods rely on technology exclusively. And much of what I write about, whenever I write about a high-tech example, I write about very low-tech examples. You asked before about using data. There's a wonderful group in Rajasthan called MKSS, which does the work of reading government budgets out loud in the town square as a form of storytelling. So they're reading data as stories in order to get people to point out bridges built to nowhere and dead people on the payroll and whatnot. You don't need to have sophisticated machine learning to be able to leverage data and insights. Most of what I'm talking about is how do you have conversations with people? And we rely a lot on learnings from the social sciences. We didn't talk here about behavioral insights and about social scientific insights and the role that they play. We didn't talk about evidence-based learning and policymaking. Those are all big parts of the book. But that said, there are tools, many of which are open source, are free and easy to use, which are making things like engaging with citizens easier to do and cheaper. In order to provide people with a baseline understanding of those tools, in the way that we teach it, we do provide some introduction to digital skills. So in the version of solving public problems that we do with people in government. Again, all free, all open. We teach digital basics, including explaining what blockchain is, including explaining what big data is, including answering, those questions that people are embarrassed to ask because they feel like they should know what blockchain is or they should know what big data are. So we try to answer those questions and discuss how they apply to problem solving so that people come in with at least enough understanding to understand how tools could be useful to them. But tools are not a prerequisite and technology is not a prerequisite to doing any of this work.
Here's a question that's also about engagement. It comes from Tracy Russ. And I can't read it all, but Tracy says, we have reasonable evidence that focusing on a singular issue through social and civic mechanisms can yield positive outcomes. How do we more permanently include these capacities as ongoing civic capacities over one-off success stories and or learning failures? She says it feels sometimes as if we build great civic festivals, then the tents get packed up and put away or forgotten, when we really need more permanent public squares that stay vital in the life of communities and people as expectations for their participation.
So it's a wonderful question, which I won't do justice to, but it's why we do a lot of our work with cities and with institutions and on research focused on how to institutionalize these practices so that they are not one-offs, so they're not what's sometimes called democracy theater. So we have a wonderful woman who used to be at the GovLab, who was a former student of mine named Dinora Cantu, who went off to become the head of public innovation and public engagement in San Pedro in Mexico. And so together with Dinora, we did a project called the City Challenge. I just put an example of that in the chat, an example from Africa. Sam will put the one from Mexico. But we started this project of co-designing urban solutions with residents with her. And what was so exciting about that project was not that we did a competition and get citizens to come up with ideas and then did a bunch of projects. It's that the city then repeated it and then legislated the use of citizen engagement as the way that they make policy in that city. It's why we did a set of case studies together with Nesta, looking at examples of cities all around the world who are engaging with residents and how they institutionalize those practices, really trying to look at what are the ingredients for going from pilot to really regular practice of co-design, collaboration, and participation as a way of solving problems. And also we talked to 12 different organizations that have been regularly leveraging engagement as a way to solve problems and put up another free course at covidcourse.thegovlab.org. Those range from Reboot to Nesta to Ushahidi and Federation of American Scientists, and to really understand the mechanics of how people are doing this kind of problem solving in practice so that we can communicate those lessons learned.
Beth, we have 5 minutes and a bunch of questions, so I'm going to read them to you, and you respond as long as you want, but the longer we go, the fewer questions we'll get to. Here's one from Gerard Ralphs, who's listening from South Africa. He works in a public research council that's mandated to produce social science research to address the country's big challenges: poverty, inequality, unemployment, et cetera. Gerard says, our organizational culture tends to be highly bureaucratic and risk averse, with only niches of innovative activity. Capacities to work with large data sets is limited. How do organizations responsible for coming up with ideas for solutions start to promote the kinds of approaches that you're advocating here?
Training, training, and training. So we cannot assume that these are innate skills. Learning how to use data, learning how to listen to citizens, these are learned skills. You don't have to become a data scientist. You can develop a capacity for understanding the value of data and then how to reach out to other people for using data and working with data. So I'm now investing a lot of my time and efforts, again, in curriculum building and in education. It's why I'm so excited about this new Burns Center that we will be launching to really try to spread this curriculum. And we're having conversations both with governments around the world and with social innovators on trying to spread the learning of these skills.
So Steve Buckley wants to hear you say more about listening, experts learning to listen. he's got a pointed question about whether anyone in Obama's open government program understood how important it was to listen. But I think the more general point is, less about a specific administration here or there. We could think about all kinds of administrations that listened or didn't listen. But like, how do we think about that problem? I mean, especially it seems to me at a moment when distrust is very high and partisanship is fierce. That listening is a tougher skill than many of us in the academy recognize.
Listening is a really, really tough skill. I know Lorelei Kelly is here, so I would ask her to put a link in the chat if she hasn't already to some of her work about how she is getting members of Congress to listen in new ways and organizing those processes again to make those practices efficient and effective. When I first went into government, someone said to me, never assume malevolence where incompetence will do. And by that expression, what they meant was, don't underestimate the fact that people just don't know how to do this. Yes, there are plenty of badly intentioned people who don't want to listen, but there are lots of people who would listen if they understood how to do it and to do it efficiently and to do it effectively in a way that actually leads to real outcomes. And so that's where research and learning are necessary. There have been great advances in how to do that. Tomorrow, I'm going to go talk at the MIT Computational Social Science Group to ask people smarter than me how they are using machine learning to enable that kind of listening now in new ways. So we already have, again, advances in the social sciences for many years that have helped us to learn how to organize dialogue, how to organize deliberation. Sociologists go out into the field all the time with effective ways of managing conversations with people, and technology is giving us new ways of doing that. So it doesn't help to solve the problem of political will, but there are many people, especially public servants more than politicians, who are eager to listen if they have the skills and the methods for how to do that.
I'll tell you, I teach a course on the sociology of climate change, and one of my favorite assignments, it's always the student's favorite assignment, is about 6 weeks into the course when their blood's really boiling and they're getting anxious and they feel like they know the problem and also how to solve it. I ask them to find a climate change skeptic who's in their social network and to have a conversation with them, not to judge, not to debate or argue, but just to try to hear what they're saying and understand what's on their minds. And you could do a comparable assignment for an individual on something like the vaccine issue. It's always very challenging, but it's also very useful. And it seems to me like, even before we get to the kind of bigger question about how officials learn to listen to a diverse set of views, getting our students to learn how to listen to one person who has something different to say is an important challenge. We have time for one more question, and it's got to be a simple one, or one, a short one, I should say. So I'm going to go to Jacques Courbe, and the question is: are there some successful examples of tools that governments can use to engage and collect information from citizens? And I presume the meaning is not like surveillance. But are there tools that you especially like for kind of getting more participation?
Yes, and this gets to Arnaud's question in the chat also about liquid democracy and new kinds of tools, again, for engaging with and listening to citizens. I think the important thing here is to recognize that there are different courses for different courses, as the expression goes. If you're looking to define problems with citizens, there are wonderful tools like your sociologist colleague, Matt Salganic at Princeton, has developed a free and open source tool that Sam will again put in the chat for me, that is used. It's wonderful for getting people to define a problem. If you want to get people to come up with solutions, there's a wonderful free and open source tool from Iceland called Your Priorities. We just used it in New Jersey, and we heard from almost 20,000 people in 2 weeks. That was wonderful for doing things at scale. There's great work being done by Deb Roy at MIT to use big data. He spoke about this also in our IP. This is like our best of IPK, Future of Democracy. So we've had all these people come and speak. He spoke a few months ago about how he's using big data to actually analyze the sentiment and meaning of what citizens are doing. But again, different tool for solving a problem than there is for defining a problem, and in turn, wonderful examples of how to get help with implementing solutions or evaluating. We have a lot of these up on a website called crowd.law and congress.crowd.law and other resources that Sam will put in the chat. And if you're looking for pointers to specific platforms and tools, happy to make recommendations. But it's a lot of what we've been doing is experimenting with what are the tools, what are the platforms, how can we make this easier?
Thanks, Beth. So I can't think of many conversations we've had at IPK where we start with 90 people and there's 80 people by the time we finish an hour later, especially when it's sunny still and beautiful in New York City. Now we have people here from South Africa and Brazil and Mexico and many other places besides. So, maybe there's nothing else to do and it's late at night in some spots, but I think, Beth, that you've hit upon something that we all want to learn more about. And we told everyone that we would break at 6 o'clock and we're going to honor our promise to make this an hour-long event. But it is also a book launch event. Let me remind everyone of Beth's book here, Solving Public Problems. Like, you could have this in your home right now as well. And because we always like to do something kind of festive and celebratory, and generally that's done with book signing, I'm going to say that we're going to close the official part of this evening, and so I'm going to thank you all for coming tonight. This has been a really terrific conversation, and Beth, I want to say especially thank you to you for writing such a thoughtful book, and for sharing your thoughts about it with us tonight. It's really great to have you here, and we wish you a terrific launch. And thanks to everyone for being here as well. And